everybody. So welcome to the webinar. Hopefully, I think most of you have been on our webinars before. If you don't know, if you need to enlarge the screen or get a better view of the screen, you can use a little icon on the top left of your screen to zoom whatever percentage you want. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to ask those through the app itself. Go into the questions tab, type your questions in there. We'll field those at the end. Or if somebody sees one interesting that pertains to something I'm covering, we'll go ahead and stop and go ahead and cover it then. What we're going to try to cover today, and hopefully I can kind of do this justice, is going to be covering some of the tools inside building ES workflows. The things I've kind of focused on are some of the more obscure or least used options that I think can be quite useful for people, including ClearKeepApprovalState, document step, the and, many, or functions, call WIFL, the node tool, and I just want to cover some specific function of the node tool that makes it a little bit more interesting, and then the save and restore working stage functionality. So that's what we hope to cover today. What I'm going to do with those is actually in preparing for the webinar, I was really concentrating, trying to think of ways to show off these features and explain how they maybe could be used in the workflow. But what I found out is that I'd probably spend half an hour just trying to explain the logic of the workflow itself. So I'm going to try to keep this pretty simple just to the functionality of the tool itself, and maybe, depending on interest, especially for Mike's tips and tricks at Duo coming up in April, we'll maybe cover some of this more in depth if people find it interesting or really want to know more about maybe some of the case scenarios. So I'm going to try to stay away from case scenarios as much as possible and still show some of these features. So we're looking at, again, it's kind of the tools over here on the right-hand side, VS, and how some of those are used inside of a workflow. This is kind of just a basic workflow I've built that shows off some of the functionality. What I have is a workflow that has a couple of approval steps, and I'm going to actually show something that can be done in approval steps that I'm not sure everybody's aware of. And then basically some logic on how to use the clear keep approval step. That's what I'm going to focus on first. To kind of focus on what that's doing, I'm going to show you on what it's actually referring to inside of the workflow. So if I go into a document workflow, and let me go ahead and pull up my approvals workflow here. I think it started like ES4. They've added this feature, remember approval state, for any of the approvals. What that function does, if it's checked on, as it is for my first approval here, is it'll actually allow that state to be remembered for every revision of the file. So as the file comes back in, if this person has done his approval, it'll remember that he did his approval. He won't have to approve the file again. It'll move on. The second approval, since it's off, will have to approve the file every time it comes through. So just to show kind of how that works in its default mode, if that's on and I go ahead and submit a file to my workflow, go ahead and run up the file. It's going to stop at the first approval. And just to simplify things, I'm just doing approvals. I'm not rejecting these files and getting to anything too complicated. So again, so my first approval has been done. Now my second approval is going through. And he's going to go through. Now the logic of my workflow, just to show something for the logic I'm doing here, I actually stopped it in a milestone stop approval, just so I could have a job ticket that gives me an option to toggle this setting differently. So if at this setting I decide, okay, I'm somebody who's making the decision on whether people need to review it again or not, I'll leave this clear approvals button off in this step. I'm rejecting the file. And basically, a file is just, as we're used to in all of our ES workflows, is a correction state or something like that. Somebody's got to fix the file, submit it back into the workflow. So let's say that was actually done. Resubmit the workflow, resubmit the file, sorry. And you'll see when this file comes in, that that first approval step's actually already been done. What didn't need to be done again, actually skipped through that, and we're at the second approval already. So we'll see that here where it actually skipped through and went through. One thing you'll notice, the timestamp does change. It just remembers that that approval was done and reapproves the file with that setting. So where you maybe would expect to see the old timestamp on this, it does refresh the timestamp. So now if the file comes through, second approver who has to approve it again because he wasn't set to remember his state, approves the file. He could come through, approve it. And now what I'm going to do is actually, just to show the difference in the functionality, if I turn that setting off, is I'm going to clear the approval states by hitting that button. And this is just a job ticket I created that toggles some metadata where the file is going to go up or down that workflow that I'll show you in a second. So now that I've cleared it, if I send the file back in, this time when the file comes through, it's going to expect both those approvals to happen. So you'll see they're both grayed out. It stops at the first approval, and that person would have to approve it again. It's kind of an easy way to sit there and toggle, have somebody make the decision on whether they want to clear them or not. And all I did here is basically just set this guy to look for the metadata. And if I hit the, there we go. So he's just looking for that clear approvals metadata, whether it's set or not, and going that route, going down to this tool. The setup of the ClearKeepApproval tool is pretty simple, but something to be aware of is basically what you're calling is the name of the approval step that you're clearing. So if I'd actually remembered the state of the approval of both of these steps, I would have to have one for each of these steps for it to be able to clear that step. So again, this is just the step name of the actual approval itself. And it'll clear that out and force the approval to happen the next time through the file, the next time the file comes through, sorry. One of the things that we also want to consider, that's the clear approval state. Another function that we've talked about showing is kind of this and, many, or functionality. The or functionality actually I showed right in this step. Basically, all or does is a connector between separate paths in the workflow that requires one of those paths to be fulfilled and come through. So basically, it's expecting as soon as one of these routes has gone through, the OR tool will happen and go to the waiting for correction. So that's basically OR. Pretty simple in that. We also have AND. The AND function actually will require all paths to go through. So just to show that real quick, I'm going to go ahead and approve this file through. And at my milestone, I'm actually going to go ahead and do the approval instead of a rejection this time. So it's going to go the top route of the workflow. And I think I'm behind a little bit here. Yeah. If you jump too far ahead of ES, sometimes it doesn't actually do your approval. No, actually, I might have caught myself again. What I actually did, and shouldn't have double clicked, is I edited the workflow and then left it edited, so it's not going to let me go forward in the workflow. So let me change that real quick. And it's not going to let me change it. All right, I'll just submit a new file to save some time here. All right, so here comes a new file coming through. Again, he's going to stop at the same approvals, and I just did it all in the one workflow just to save time of not hopping through too many workflows because I do have some other ones to show later. Second approval. And now again, I'm going to go ahead and approve this instead of rejecting it. So I'm going to go to my top branch of my workflow. Basically, all it's doing, just for simplicity, is it's jumping through to 3 different milestones in the workflow that are all just step validations. So they're just waiting to be approved, step forward, and all 3 are going to have to be realized before it goes to the AND. So if I approve one, the file is going to stay in place. Approve another one, file will stay in place. Again, I can look at that. See, it's still held here. Both of these have been approved. I go through my third one, jumps through, it's approved. And what I'll do is actually change job tickets here. And actually, let me modify something in my workflow because I think I overrode something. Nope, many. Okay, good. All right, so I'm just going to change workflows real quick to one that uses the many. And just to show you how many would work. Again, go ahead and grab a new file. Approve it through. And just to show what I have going on there. So we're held at the three same ones at the and was being held at. But in the many, my configuration, my parameter is simply a count. So in this case, I just arbitrarily set it to 2. You can use metadata or anything to fill this in as well, your parameter set, something like that. But I just hard set it to 2. So I'm expecting 2 of these to be approved. It could be any of the 2. Then as soon as the second one's approved, it'll jump to complete the workflow, it's finished. So that's just different ways to use those type functions. One thing to be aware of for those of you who haven't upgraded necessarily, who maybe still be running ES3, the AND functionality was kind of the default in how ES3 ran. What we've noticed was you, the ES4, AND is necessary to put in the workflow. So you may have a workflow that's running in ES3 that doesn't have an AND. It will probably not work correctly in ES4, and you will have to put the AND statement in. Okay, so that's kind of the AND, many, or. And see now, let me show you a little bit of the document step functions. So some of you have seen document step, don't really know how many of you have used it for anything, but basically you can do 3 different functions in it. You can do a rename of the file, a creation of a file, so you can actually copy the file and process it as a different file, or you can actually do deletions with it as well. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and do a copy of it and a deletion just to show 2 of those functions. So if I go ahead and send a file in, I'll show you what that workflow looks like. Just very basic workflow. I stop the file just to show the functionality basically. And I have 2 different document steps. The first document step is set up with a parameter for it to do document creation. So it's going to do a copy of this document, and I have the workflow variable selected. So basically it'll do a copy, submit it to a workflow in the same project, and then I can use name to actually rename the file using Java or just manually name it, or whatever I want to do inside of here. If I do just rule pattern instead of WIFL, it'll actually create a file on the ES file system, and you would basically create a rule set maybe to pick it up from a hot folder and run it to a different project or anything like that. So you can do the rule patterns as well. I just thought it'd be more visible to actually just show it in here. And then basically I have a document step at the end that's just going to delete my document. So it's going to delete the actual file that was submitted to the workflow at the end, which is something that's interesting for people because you could use it maybe for archiving functions, setting up an approval step at the right before it that times out after a certain number of days or a month or whatever it might be. You could use it in asset management workflows possibly, where if you reject a file, it could delete the file after, so you're not keeping files around that have been, not selected or rejected inside of an asset management type path. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this file through. it will go through my document step. Again, what it's going to do is create a second document, name it as I had it named. So basically, I'm just picking up my project name, my customer name, webinar, and then rename that PDF was just text I had put in there itself. So again, this is just a copy of this workflow. It ran through the Whiffle dialog milestone workflow because that's where I told it to go specifically. Now, if I take this file again, remember I still have my document step at the end. I'm holding it at this milestone here. And if I approve that, step it through, it's going to go ahead and delete that file. So it's just a way to show the two files, not saying that that's any practical use of it, but it is a good way to clean up files maybe that you're done with in the workflow, or get rid of them. Same function you can use is basically is that to rename the file if you have any purpose of wanting to rename the file so visibly inside of ES it has a proper name that you want. You can do a function like this in this workflow. Just do document renaming, and again, use that Java code or whatever you want inside of here to go ahead and name the file to a different name. And that's going to change it, not at the file system level, it's just changing it inside of what you see in ES, the document ID, what it's called. So maybe you just have a purpose to show it differently there. Okay. Another thing we go through in workflows, and if you look at this Whiffle dialog split, for instance, everyone's kind of always seen this call Whiffle tool in here. It's used pretty basically. In this case, basically, it's just this workflow splits a multi-page PDF, takes the individual pages down this route, and basically just calls the Whiffle dialog workflow. Very simplistic, but wanted to show a couple other things with it and how it can be used to call a workflow from the middle. Now, I made this was kind of a hard one for me to figure out how to show it easily. So what I did is really created some very basic workflows. And what I'm showing this one is actually a function of the node tool as well. So if you look, we have the most basic workflow you could have in here. You know, just input files, approved. So a file's going to come in, it's going to approve. We also have this kind of floater down here. Now, we've all heard, or hopefully most of you have heard, you really can't have segments of workflows like this, because what will happen, and I'm going to go ahead and change this just to show what actually happens with that. What will happen if you use a workflow this way, and this one. Let's see, this is my second workflow. Clean up to avoid confusion here. Okay, sorry. So what will happen is if you run a workflow the way it's set up right now, run a file in, it's actually going to go both routes inside of the workflow. So any tool, whether it's left hanging, even if you left it hanging by accident, ES will submit the file to that tool. So you notice here there's timestamps on input files to approved, and also node to my first path milestone here. So it went both ways. There's a nice function inside of the node tool that allows you actually to set cancel on so it won't take that path. So if you have a need to have a floating part of your workflow that you want to submit files to manually or start in the middle of a workflow, you can do that by setting that function, setting the action to cancel inside the node tool, and then building whatever workflow logic you want. Sometimes, you know, there may be instances where you don't want to build separate workflows because the approvals in ES can get complex and you can't match approvals. So you have your template that can't account for all the approvals that might be in another piece. Might be a reason to do this. Again, we may cover this some on the Duo tips and tricks to show some viable uses for it. But in this case, I'm going to just show that now I can come in here, come back to this, and if I submit a file now, this is not the same file. This file is going to come in, and I hate when I hit S instead of W. Sorry. and you'll see at the node tool it's actually canceled. So by canceling it, it won't go down that route. It'll just follow the main logic of the workflow. Now what you can do with that in hand with using the call WIFL workflow, so I'm going to go ahead and change my document workflow here to that. And I'll show you what that's going to do in a second. So now if I submit another file through here, so this file is going through, and basically we have a call WIFL set in the middle of a workflow. This call WIFL is set up with calling the workflow name, webinar second workflow, the one we were just talking about, and specifically calling a step inside of that workflow called first path. That's the name of that milestone I had sitting after the node tool. I'm calling it specifically by name. Unfortunately, with ES, there's no way for you to have a pull down of the tools optional, so you do have to maybe copy and paste or know what the name of your tool is that you're calling. But by calling the step name here, it'll actually submit the file directly to that workflow and that tool. The other option inside call WIFL is synchronized. If you notice, this shows call WIFL and it's running at this step. It hasn't finished the step, it's just staying at running, and that's because we have it synchronized where it has to wait for the other workflow we call the finish before it'll continue this workflow. To wait kind of the synchronized workflows and have a smaller workflow maybe run as a piece of a larger workflow or something like that. So you'll see actually, and if you have basically a file that does jump to workflows via call workflow, you'll see workflow name here. You can actually view the progress of both of them by toggling on the workflow name here. And you'll see we actually jump straight to this first path tool here. So it doesn't run up here, just straight to that tool. And if we had workflow after this, it would just run through that tool itself. So in this case now, if I go ahead and step through this, it'll come through, run the file, and finish the file up in the workflow. So boom, I'm at approved, and it'll show obviously that this just was approved and stepped through. Just kind of how those functions work in hand with each other and go through. So the last thing I wanted to show is a bit of a sample of using kind of the restore and save working stage stuff. So to show you the workflow for that, and I think most of you kind of have seen this, just didn't know how many people actually maybe had seen it function or thought of maybe uses of it, so I kind of wanted to cover this a little bit. So basically what we have is a basic workflow where file's going to come in, it's going to go to twist and convert to an X1A in this case. So I'm going to submit maybe a PDF X4 to this workflow. I put a save working stage before the twist tool. So typically from what we've built in the workflows, the save working stage always comes before a twist step, before a step where the file is being modified. So in this case, all we're doing is giving the stage a name. We're saying X4. So before it goes to twist, we're saving a reference to that file that's called X4. Could have named it whatever I wanted to. Then we're going to go to twist. We're going to normalize the file. I'm just doing an approval, so I'm going to stop the file and take a look at it that it's converted to CMYK. That's an X1A. Then we're going to have a restore working stage where I'm going to restore back that stage X4. So the file will swap out the working file in ES from being the X1A that was created at twist to back to the X4, and I'll just check that again in this workflow. This is nice for something like maybe a digital edition workflow where up front you're getting RGB files and you're able to stash those. And then we have customers that have workflows where they're actually stashing them on disk and they're using like a wait on and twist to pick it back up when the files get submitted at the end. You can do this all in ES this way. And then your digital edition workflow may be triggered out of here from the original RGB file after it's been approved.
Fred, my eyesight might be going on me, but did you have a capital X for both of those? I thought one of them might have been. Okay, was the other one capital or lowercase? He's cap. Okay, good. I just didn't want to trip up over
I was thinking,
stupid
it
like
worked
that.
when I tested it. But yeah, because that would bite you, obviously.
Yeah.
All right. So I won't save changes since I know this worked before. And if I go to my workflow here and get rid of this. So this is just a basic job. I got that workflow, the webinar states workflow set to go here. And another thing I'm going to show in this is actually submitting the file from InDesign. So for those of you who don't know, most of you I think that are on this already know there is a plugin for InDesign that works with ES and Twist. Basically, you go in, set up your user settings so you can submit files to your ES workflow or to Twist itself. So what I'm going to do is take this RGB file here, go ahead and export the PDF to ES. And I'm a different user, so I see all of my workflows, but I'm going to go to State Workflow, call the file whatever I want. I take my Adobe PDF presets, and I'm using those to make that PDF, submit that straight to ES. And so it's my X4 preset, export it. Takes a little bit. Comes in, file comes into ES. So that's an X4 created out of InDesign, submitted straight to ES. It should probably, and I don't know if I set an approval up for this, but yeah, there you go. So check CMYK. So this is run through Twist. It's normalized it. And I meant to change the HTML dialog, but just bear with me a second while the Java runs up. Hate when I forget to do things like that during a webinar. So I had no preview generation, so it's having to do it. You'll see this is a CMYK file of the page that I just created. Good enough. Y'all believe me on that. Now if I go ahead and approve this, you'll see it's actually going to run through. We did our save. Now we did our restore, and we're at check RGB approval step held there just so I can take a look at it again in Java, unfortunately. And you'll see now we have an RGB file again. It's back to the original X4 that we looked at, and we're able to move on with that. So a great way to actually save a stage is maybe you're saving before and after a trap stage where you're able to pull back the untrapped file at the end, possibly. Nice way to actually do that. So I think that, yeah, it's like half an hour. I think we covered a good bit of what we wanted to cover. Let's see.
There's a few questions here, Fred.
All right, go ahead.
The first one is that keep approval option that you set up earlier. Is that for all of the approvers on a specific step, or is it for selected approvers at the step where you turned it on?
So let's go take a look at that. And basically you have the option to turn it on for any of the specific approvers at that step. So if you notice, the checkbox is next to that approver. If I add another approver, there's another checkbox. And whatever he is, I can have it off for him. So I can have it on for one, off for the other. Or turn it on for all of them at that step.
I think you answered this next one earlier, but I'll run it by you anyways. Is the document step that you used earlier with that rename option, is it really renaming the file or just changing the way ES displays that name for us?
Yeah, we did talk about that. It is, in this case, it is renaming the display in ES. It's not changing what's in the file system. Which, of course, is kind of a, at least in the current version of ES, it really doesn't matter what is in the file system, because actually at the file system level, there's a prefix on the file as it is with ES and a code after it before the file name as it was uploaded. So it's kind of not meant to be seen visibly, and you use your digital deliveries or your deliveries through Twist, however you're sending files out of ES, to name the file how you want it anyway. So it's strictly just changing what's displayed inside of ES.
Okay, the next one, someone must have been looking real close at the buttons when you opened them up. They asked, what is the synchronize button when you're setting up that call WIFL step?
Okay, we did kind of cover that, but basically they're talking about this button here, synchronized inside of a call whiffle step. And what I'll do is actually go back and show that again real quick. If you notice the way I had it set before, the file basically stayed running at call whiffle and didn't move to approved until I validated it in the other workflow. If I turn this off, what's going to happen is the file will just go all the way to approved and not worry how long it takes to get through the other workflow. So that's kind of the easiest explanation, and I don't remember which workflow had that in.
So it's synchronized within the main workflow. It can't go past call whiffle until the whiffle it called is done.
Is done, correct. Yeah, so now I'll show you that with that running off, and hopefully I didn't select the same file. Doesn't matter in this one. So here's my file. It's going to run through, and you see it's already at approved, because as soon as it sent it to the second workflow, even though it's still held here, it jumped all the way to approved. So hey, I sent it, I'm done. If you have synchronized on, it's got to wait for that other one to be done before it will jump all the way to the next step inside of the first workflow.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions.
I had another one and something I wanted to cover real quick, and I just wrote on this. There's another tool in here somebody noticed was folder step. Where's folder step at?
Go up. There you go. No, it's under IO.
Oh, I would miss it.
Yeah.
Folder step is another one that can be useful inside of a workflow. I don't have anything prepared to really show for this, but basically what you can do is actually set up a path on a file, or, well, a path in your ES project structure. And so this would be a subfolder in ES. Subfolder does have to exist for it to go. But basically, if you put a folder step at a certain point in your workflow, it'll take the file and put it in that folder. So it's a way to move a file into a given folder inside the workflow. And you can do subfolders and multiple levels of subfolders. And then you can put it in, and they have this option, do not start the folder workflow after move. Basically, if you have that on, it'll just copy the file into the folder. If you have that button off, it'll actually run, if you have that folder set to do something like run a different workflow, it'll run it through that workflow. I've used this in my demo workflows where I take the multi-page PDF I might submit to a workflow. After it's split, take the multi-page and put it in a folder, and then let the other pages process so I don't have the multi-page sitting in my clipboard if I don't have the option on to delete it. So just another tool that can be used to kind of organize how your projects are set up. So is that it, Mike?
That should do it.
All right. So just a reminder, everyone, we do try to have these on the second Wednesday of every month. You can go to our events page to see when they're scheduled. If you have topics you want covered or would like covered in one of these webinars, feel free to send them to us at text@blanchard.com. We'll be happy to incorporate those in if we think it makes a lot of sense and there'll be a lot of interest in them. We do have Duo next month. It'll be, I think it's what, February 16th and 17th, or 15th through 17th, if I'm not mistaken.
April.
And that'll be here, yeah, in April, and that'll be here in New Orleans. So if you haven't registered for it, please consider joining us here for it. It's going to be a good event. Some new stuff's going to be added to it. We're going to do kind of live sessions during breaks where we'll actually have some computers out where we can show some of the new functions or cover your workflows, kind of try to be a little bit more hands-on or let people touch and feel the new product a little bit more. So other than that, thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.